Well, I'm here today with Mike Maharrey of the 10th Amendment Center. We did an incredible interview on our radio station, JRB, and this is kind of going to be a follow-up to that interview. I'm going to start out by reminding you, when I asked you what nullification was all about, you say, well, I nullify things all the time. When my daughter comes down and she's not dressed appropriately and I send her back to her room to change her clothes, I'm really exercising my nullification rights.
Exactly, yeah. We call it wardrobe nullification at our house, and it doesn't happen too frequently, but sometimes we have to do it. It's the people with the legitimate authority asserting that and making sure that the agent does what they're supposed to do. So, yeah, it works like that. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this on air, but we've nullified certain signs that are in this convention hall today. So, nullification happens all the time.
And it's a good thing that it does, because in actuality, that's what we should be doing. When we see things that aren't right, when we see things that shouldn't be, it is our obligation as free and sovereign individuals to nullify them.
That's absolutely right. And it's, Rosa Parks is one of my favorite characters in history, because she was willing to take that step. She was willing to say, this is unjust. I'm not going to get up and walk to the back of the bus. I'm not going to sit idly by for somebody to trample on my rights. And she was willing to sit there and say no, and she did it in a peaceful way. And granted, she suffered consequences in the short run, but her action sparked a movement that essentially killed Jim Crow. So the power of no is amazing, and it can start with just one individual. And I always want people to know that, it's not just about being a politician or being a prominent individual. One person, an action, can spark a major thing in somebody's life. So
really, that's what the 10th Amendment Center is all about. It's trying to bring to the fore, to people's attention, that they do, as individuals and as groups of individuals, they have the right to nullify things that they know are wrong.
Exactly.
When it comes to the law, the Constitution, and things like that, I know that you made a presentation in the state of Tennessee. Tell me about that again.
Well, yeah, it was interesting. I actually testified before a Senate hearing. It was on a Second Amendment issue, and essentially what I did was I addressed the misconceptions and misunderstanding that were forwarded by their Attorney General there in Tennessee, in his recommendation that the state could not resist an unconstitutional federal act. And it was a challenge actually doing that, because I had to get a little bit more into the lawyer head and actually talk about some of the legal principles. Lawyers want to talk about cases, and they don't understand constitutional history. So I had to kind of start with some of those basic cases like Marbury, and explain that they're being misunderstood, even within the context of those cases, by some of the legal people. And I don't even think a lot of the time, I don't think it's necessarily nefarious. I think it's just what they're taught. It's the law school training, and they have a hard time getting out of that paradigm. So I really took the whole idea of Marbury, and what Marbury was really saying was that, yes, the Supreme Court, in making a judgment, has the authority to appeal to the Constitution. Nowhere did he say that the Supreme Court was the only authority or the final and a definitive authority. And I think it's, if you look at some of the Supreme Court opinions that we've had over history, I don't think we would want to call them the final authority. When you look at Dred Scott, or you look at Prigg versus Pennsylvania, or some of these convoluted Supreme Court cases, obviously there has to be a check outside of the system. It can't be the federal government trying to limit itself. That's a ridiculous notion. So there has to be something outside, and that's the states. Those are the sovereign political societies that pre-existed the Constitution, that formed the Constitution, and they have a role in checking federal power. And this goes back all the way to Madison, even before the ratification, that he laid that blueprint out in Federalist 46.
Well, I think when we had our interview, there were two things that came out that I thought were extremely important. The first thing you said was that the federal government is the creation of sovereign states.
Right.
And therefore it is not a party to the Constitution on equal footing with the states. That is a concept that really is not so much a legal concept. It's not something you're going to find in case law.
Right.
That's a historical fact of contract law, that when people get together and make a contract, the corporation that they create does not able to turn around and tell the creators,
Exactly.
okay, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. I mean, I think that's an incredibly important concept, and I wish more of our legislators would actually be able to understand that concept.
You're absolutely right. And it's interesting, in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, which was probably the most equally divided of all of the states in terms of Federalists and Anti-Federalists, there was a great question as to whether the Constitution was going to be ratified in Virginia, and the people on the fence were actually convinced by an argument by George Nichols that essentially made that contract argument that you just made. And he actually said, if you have 13 individuals who enter into a contract, that one party of that contract stipulates something in it, then it is binding on all the rest. So he was essentially saying that when Virginia says the federal government is limited, it's limited to its enumerated powers. He said if the federal government oversteps that, then Virginia is exonerated from that contract. Just like it would be if you had a mortgage with your bank and all of a sudden they said, oh, we're just going to ignore the contract and raise your interest rate 5%. Well, you wouldn't be obligated to that. So what you're saying is actually rooted in history, and you can actually see this debate play out if you read the Virginia Ratifying Convention notes, and they're out there for people to read.
I think one of the interesting things when you're talking about ratification of the Constitution is if you read what went on in each individual state ratifying convention, some of the most incredible writing was done in those conventions, but it's very clear. They meant beyond any doubt that federal government had to be severely limited and that each state retained its own sovereignty.
Right.
And that really speaks to things like secession.
True.
I mean, true. I mean, if you join a corporation as a party and they start doing things you don't want, well, you have the right to say, I'm sorry. It's beyond, I don't want to participate in that anymore.
Right.
One of the other things you said in our interview, which I thought was incredibly important, was that the Supreme Court does not really have the right to rubber stamp what is constitutional for the federal government. If they did, then whatever, since it's a political institution now, whatever
Right.
whatever the federal government wants to do, the Supreme Court would say, oh, okay.
Exactly.
Well, that's all
And
right.
then essentially,
there's no check.
Exactly, and essentially that's the system we have. And this is this idea that the federal supremacists have that somehow that the federal government is going to be a self-limiting institution. There's no such thing as a self-limiting institution.
Certainly not when you come to government.
Exactly. I mean, it's obviously going to try to accumulate more power. That's the nature of the beast, and everybody understood that. And I think what you said was very important. There is no debate that the federal government was intended to be limited to its enumerated powers. The debate during the ratification was not whether we're going to have a strong federal government or a weak federal government. The debate was, will this Constitution give us the limited federal government that we expect?
And will this Constitution be the leash and the collar on the federal
Exactly.
government that we need as individual sovereign states to make sure that we don't get trampled on
Right.
like we just got out from under the yoke of a tyrant
Right.
in England.
So the analogy that I like to use to show the absurdity of this idea that the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of constitutionalism is, I use a basketball or football analogy. We'll go basketball since we're here in North Carolina. You've got the game between Duke and North Carolina, and somebody decides, okay, well, the player for Duke, he gets to be the referee. Nobody in North Carolina that's a Tar Heel fan is going to accept that bargain because obviously the Duke player is not going to be a very good referee. And that's essentially what people are saying. Well, we've got the states and the people over here, we've got the federal government, so we're going to let this part of the federal government, these federal employees, decide what the federal powers are. Well, then essentially, like you said, we have an unlimited federal government, and that's what we've evolved to. So our goal at the 10th Amendment Center is to begin to teach the states and utilize the power of the states to be the check that they were intended to be. And I really encourage people to go read Federalist 46. James Madison gave us the blueprint for nullification before the Constitution was even ratified. He said, when the federal government has an unwarrantable act, he said the means of opposition are powerful and at hand. And he lists them out. He said there would be protests by the governors and the people. He said that there would be legislative devices from the states that would create impediments. And he talked about refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And those are the tools that we have to nullify, which is essentially to make a law null and void within the borders of a given state. So Madison gave us this blueprint before the Constitution was even ratified. And What we're trying to do at the 10th Amendment Center is to take that blueprint and apply it to these specific issues: NSA spying, NDAA detention, Second Amendment issues, Obamacare. All of these things, we can use these ideas, legislative devices, refusal to cooperate. All of these things can be used to pull the rug out from under federal power, and it works. We've seen it work with the medical marijuana issue. I mean, we have 21 states today with medical marijuana programs, and the federal government says, no, that's illegal. And then the others say, well, we're not going to enforce it, though. Well, then it's nullified. If they're not going to enforce it, it's not really a law.
I think that's an important point, again, that if enough states stand up and nullify things that really go beyond the scope of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the federal government is really powerless. The states are numerous, their citizens are numerous, they have the ability to nullify what the federal government does, and I certainly hope and pray that they do.
Yep.
Michael Maharrey, always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Great for you to be here.